Susie. How you doing today?
Hi, Four Arrows. I'm doing really well. How about you?
I had a good day of surfing, and now we have another storm coming here in Mexico. I'm
Well,
looking forward to hearing what I didn't get a chance to look at what you did with your children's books. I'm really looking forward to that today. And I know what we're going to be doing is bringing the idea of worldview to bear on the listeners of this program. And worldview is not something that is talked about very much. The Institute of Noetic Sciences in California was founded by the seventh man to walk on the moon, Edgar Mitchell. When he was up there, he had an epiphany and looking down on Earth, and he quit NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, and came back and founded this very well-known Institute for Noetic Education. And when he was up there, he said, only a handful of visionaries understand that in our original nature-based worldview that we can call for the rest of this presentation for about 40 minutes, the indigenous worldview, a worldview that guided us for about 99% of human history until the dominant worldview, which is really more or less based on a Western European contemporary view of about 9,000 years ago. So why is that important? Well, we're in a lot of trouble in our world today. Climate change, pandemics, violence, polluted air, water. So everybody knows that. And if not, their heads in the sand, right? And so what is the fundamental idea of worldview is that's the foundation of our belief systems. Now, worldview originally was a German philosophical term, but it was put back on the map by the father of social anthropology, Robert Redfield in Chicago. And he said, actually, worldview is about looking at nature, human nature, and super nature, and how those human beings think about nature and the sort of mystical world. And he divided them into three worldviews: the Eastern, the Western, and the primitive. Later on, he said the Eastern had really come to terms with buying into the Western. And then in the 1950s, he said there's really primarily these two. And all the religions, cultures, philosophies, ideologies fit under one of those two, no matter how greatly diverse they are, and they are very diverse, right? But I'll give you just one example, and then we can kind of jump into it from there.
sure.
One example would be the idea of human-centeredness, or it's called anthropocentrism, and sort of get a more academic term. This idea that humans are the supreme creature on Earth, that everything we do is about humans and their benefit, and that all the other life forms, whether it be trees or insects or birds or fish, are there for the use of human beings. Now, a lot of people who are pet lovers would say, oh, I don't like that, because I really love my dog or my cat or my goldfish. But we're talking about what is the foundation of the culture, the education, the religions, the institutions, the corporations, the media. What's the foundation that guides how we're living in ways that have caused us to be so out of balance? That's the worldview. And that worldview is largely anthropocentric. I say largely because that's what runs the institution. Are there people that are outside of that with different spiritual or religious traditions or philosophical traditions? Sure. But we're talking about that mainstream. And until we can get that mainstream into our nature-based worldview, there are more and more philosophers, and I could drop names all day here of people that have endorsed my books and endorsed this concept. Worldview is the thing. And that's why the Institute of Noetic Sciences is bringing it into younger grade levels that you're going to be talking about. They have a program where they say worldview is the most important thing we can do in K-4 education, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Great, fabulous. Well, I'm going to back us up just a moment, and I would love for you to introduce yourself, and I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll move on. So you go ahead.
All right, so I am Wahink Betopa, 4 Arrows. My Irish Anglo name is Don Trent Jacobs. I go by my Lakota name because I believe strongly as an academic and a professor. I was Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota College, where I did my Sundance vows on Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm now with Fielding Graduate University as a professor in the educational leadership. And I write books that can be found at 4arrowsbooks.com on the topics of Indigenous worldview applications in contemporary society.
Great. So it was very lucky that I met you at the beginning of my doctoral work. I currently I've been a teacher for a very long time. My sweet spot that I love dearly is kindergarten. But I've also been a reading specialist, and now I'm on faculty at Bank Street College, and decided that I wanted to go back and get my doctorate. And when I came to Fielding, really the reason for Arrows I chose you as my mentor is that I wanted to pursue something that had a broader impact. And you, boy, in that first little while, you really convinced me. And it's not just me, obviously. I mean, we look at the United Nations, it came out with a study, correct, that that really in order to save our planet, we need to look at those areas that are actually being shepherded and heralded by Indigenous people. Those are the areas on the earth that are the most well taken care of. And as we have gone along, we have discussed all of these aspects about Indigenous worldview. And I think what is interesting to me, and something that you just said last week when we talked about this area of study is, as educators, and especially a lot of these educators who are viewing this on the Ed Collab, we have heard and talked about decolonizing for so long, and yet we haven't really talked about, so once we decolonize, what then, right? And so I think that's where this Indigenous worldview comes into play. And so we will talk about that today in a concrete way in terms of children's lit. But one of the things, so we're going to show, not yet, but we're going to show a list, right, of manifestations of the dominant culture and Indigenous. So you at home can start to grapple and understand a little bit more kind of what those two scenarios look like. But before we do that, I'd like to understand, because many times when people look at this list, they say, it's too binary. So can you discuss that a little bit? Because we will see this list that has one side and then the other, but can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. And also I want to hinge off of something you said about decolonization. The idea of decolonization really relates to the problems of racism and inequality, against all different marginalized groups. All of those things, more and more people are saying, is a result of the initial colonization of the Americas, where people came in and did what they did. That there's still a settler mentality amongst all of us in how we live that somehow allows for these inequities to happen. And so when we look at, well, if there are worldview foundational thoughts that allow us to be more materialistic, to be more anthropocentric, to be more fear-based, all the kinds of things like that, then we have this binary, because life is binary. We have night, we have day, we have cold, we have hot. But in the dominant worldview, the binary is considered rigid enough to refer to dominant worldview or the Western worldview as a binary worldview, because we tend to say you're either with us or against us, as one of our presidents once said, right? Whereas in the indigenous way, we also see binaries, we also see polarizations, masculine, feminine, on and down the line, but we see a complementarity, like the sun and the moon have so many things where they work in ways that they depend on one another somehow, or there's a balance between the two. And so when you're right, when people look at the worldview chart that has 40 precepts of that are contrast, some really good liberal academics who are all for what the social ecological justice issues are all about, they go, whoa, this is a rigid binary. And I always say, well, that's because you're used to living in a rigid binary world. But if you look at how can we bring balance to the way materialism has us out of balance by looking at a more spiritual worldview? How can we do that? And when can we do that? And what's the context, right? And what are the advantages sometimes of having a materialistic bent, but not a materialistic lifestyle? And so there's nuances that we bring to this chart and have people really look at what's the foundation of my worldview to begin with. I didn't even think about anthropocentrism as something that there was any alternative to that, right? And so it gets people to start thinking, and then but because these 40 precepts are all connected, there's a whole lot more to it. And I think the children's books that you're going to talk about, and whether they're indigenous oriented or not, those values belong to all of us. So right. The idea of justice or taking care of the planet or being generous, those don't belong to any group. We're not talking about groups here. We're talking about a people who are still being colonized, having their land taken away, their rights taken away, who are losing their languages and their ability to, as you said, maintain, like this largest study ever done, the UN Biodiversity Report, that their worldview that makes them take care of that land is starting to disappear. So how can we decolonize, not only by helping indigenous peoples who still are here with that worldview work and help us when they can, but how do we get ourselves back into that worldview in this non-binary?
Right. Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point, because through my studies and through my work with other folks, sometimes the reaction can be, well, we're not going to all go back. I mean, we have technology, we have all of these advances, as we might say. So how does worldview come through? And so I think this idea, I remember you and I were talking about in Montana, it's not that we would tear everything down and say, okay, it's time to go back. It's when we go to make a decision about constructing something, say a new housing project, that we actually are thinking much more carefully about the impact that it's going to have on the environment. We have those precepts in the back of our mind as we're going forward, correct?
Well, you bring up a really good point on two levels. One, yes, the answer is that those decisions being based on a worldview that understands the pitfalls of fear-based living or hierarchy or materialism are definitely going to make a difference when we make choices for our future. But also there's something that's called place-based Indigenous education that's different than worldview, right, that you and I are not able to teach because neither one of us speak fluently one of our original native languages, grew up in the same place where we know all the purposes of every plant and the animals. We don't have that. That's being just lost, unfortunately, right? But that place-based education is called TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And scientists for about 20 years have said that whenever people go into developed places in the world, they should bring in the local indigenous people for that knowledge.
Right.
But we're not talking about that knowledge here. We're talking about how underneath that knowledge is a worldview that we can use in places where that knowledge has been lost to re-understand the base of what is happening. But we can't do that with a worldview that doesn't care, or that says money is really what counts, or hierarchy is more important. That's why this is sort of a place where everybody can go. And then if we can have indigenous people that are still alive and operating, support them as much as we can for their sovereignty. And where they're not, which is many places, so many tribes have become extinct or have lost their language, then we've got to go back in and re-indigenize to the place we live in.
Yep. All right. Is there anything else you can think of before we dive into our worldview chart?
Well, you know, the decolonizing movement has taken a big step forward with the University of North Carolina just recently. They did a certification program in decolonizing the academy. So this is where, you know, education at all levels starts, is up at the higher education. And they came up with 3 things. One is, let's look at the gatekeeper. Who's holding on to this Western knowledge and not letting anything else come in? And that was the one idea. The other is, how do we give more people voice, people from more different cultures who can bring in other ideas that challenge that status quo, or what we call the hegemonic education. And then the other is how do we allow research to go from a different place, an alternative way of looking at things, like in my book, The Authentic Dissertation. As you said at the very beginning, that gets to identifying the problems, but it doesn't fill in what to do. So we've come full circle to say what you're doing, and going to talk about with even the children's books, you know, everything you needed to know you learn in kindergarten, right? We're talking about, okay, yeah, we're going to have to be critical, and we want that to continue on what's not working. But we're bringing worldview in, and the precepts of generosity and justice and those kind of things. We're going to bring those in, because if those get there, then the problems will go away.
Yeah, yeah, really so powerful. So you know what I think we will do for ours? I'm going to share my screen, and just for everyone at home, it's going to seem like a lot on the screen. What we've done is we've highlighted a few that we'd like to look at, because those are the ones that we're going to look at through these books. So, and as I share the screen, this came, all this information through your scholarly research. And is from your book, The Red Road, correct?
Right. Well, it was published in the Red Road, but I can now I'm putting it into to all my books. But yeah, this is none of these precepts have been cited, because that's a whole nother doctoral program.
Right.
But there are many indigenous scholars, anthropologists, etc., who have identified worldviews, indigenous worldviews, dominant worldviews, Western worldviews. And so this is a composite that I've just used for guidelines.
Great. So let's just read through the ones that are highlighted. And if you want to say anything about any of those, that's great. And then afterwards, we'll look at some books that will emphasize some of these. So again, just for all of you at home, remember, it's not a binary. There is some complementarity here. And so just remember that. So it's hard for me to read this and not read all of them, but to give you an idea. So the dominant worldview, living without strong social purpose, and that's not to say everybody does, but that is kind of that end. And then in the indigenous, socially purposeful life, right?
Yeah, and I think the distinction there is the idea of the social purpose. We tend to, in our institutions and including education, look at purpose as a hierarchy of materialism, a better job, a better living, those kinds of things, which is not bad. So that takes away the binary right away, right?
Right.
All of us want that, right? But what the research shows is that that has become more and more a model of our TV programs, our heroes. All this stuff is much more about winning competition through
Right.
ego satisfaction or personal gain, which is sort of the second one that we're talking about
Yeah,
here.
focus on self or gain or emphasis on community welfare, absolutely. And so many of them do, right? They run into each other. I found a really interesting one is the rigid and discriminatory gender stereotypes. And in the Indigenous world, the respect for various gender roles and fluidity. And actually, Burroughs, remind me of the word that they use.
Well, there's not one word. Each tribe has its own. Like the Navajos refers to Bardash, but and then in more recent times, the indigenous gay and lesbian people have called themselves two-spirited, but that's not
That's
really.
what I was. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's what you're thinking of. No, that's a relatively recent term. No,
Yeah.
it was just in the natural world. We know from animal studies that the occasion for having same sex, both in behaviors and in biology, happens in nature. We all start out with both when we're in the fetus, right? And so when someone in an indigenous culture had more of the hormones or whatever to want to do the roles of the women and dress as a woman or vice versa, it was just seen as a natural thing. There was no big deal made out of it. But when, of course, the Europeans came, they had been trained by the religions, and those people were literally fed to the dogs, right? So that's just one example. Is where because our religions are part of a worldview, right? And so that's just another one of those things. And the strong social purpose life is an emphasis on community welfare, right? And so community welfare can't happen when you reject a proportion of your society.
Yeah. So the next two actually I'm going to group together is Earth as an unliving it as compared to Earth and all systems as living and loving. And then down there, the second one, anthropocentric with animalistic and biocentric, right? Around how the Earth is actually, we are all intimately connected. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Right. So when we even the most passionate individuals that I know and who love their animals or their horses or whatever, right? If you really sit down and talk to them about the earth or about the woods or the forests or there's this this pronoun it really is kind of what guides how they think about them. When I've done a lot of presentations around the world where I've started when people come into the room, would everyone put your materials down and walk out in the lobby and out that door, and there's a group of bushes and trees there. I want you to touch one and come back in. They all look at me like I'm kind of crazy. And then when they come back in, I say, now, you're going to laugh probably or be frustrated that you came here and I'm making you do this, but I want you to go back out and do it again. But this time, I want you to ask permission and wait for an answer. And, I've done this with Japanese Buddhist monks, and I've done it with drive-by shooters and residential treatment programs, right? And invariably over the years, no matter what country I'm in, when people come back, somebody cries when their stories are told, the narratives are told about their experience, that they get some sense of the sentience from the plant, some sense of a communication that happened. And many of them are very dramatic, other ones aren't. But that is what we're really talking about, is if there's a distinction between the cultural worldviews, the worldviews that have created cultures, um, that are truly spiritual, not necessarily orthodox religious. They really see that there is the same sentience, intelligence, soul, if you will.
Yes.
And that we are intimately interconnected.
Yeah. Whereas we just have a couple more of these to look at. I mean, we could spend all day on this, but they're lacking empathy and empathetic. I think those also go, right, when we are really looking at the emphasis on community welfare, on not being so concerned about ourselves.
Well, one example that is also another worldview precept is when there's conflict resolution, and most of our dominant worldview cultures is really about punishment, revenge.
Right.
Whereas in the indigenous way of understanding, it's usually about bringing people back into community. So empathy is required for that, there, but for the, go I sort of thing, right?
Yep.
Right.
A couple others that I wanted to just talk about before we head into the books was the acceptance of injustice versus intolerance of injustice, which is huge. Emphasis on rights as opposed to emphasis on responsibility. And really interesting one for me that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. The ceremony is a rote formality versus ceremony as life-sustaining. Will you talk just a little bit, and then we're going to get into the books?
All right, great. Well, the ceremony one can go very deep, because ceremony is a form of trance-based learning. Trance-based healing has been the way that indigenous people understood along with plant medicines, of course, healing, growth, transformation. And the idea that ceremonies, which are done for so many reasons, purification ceremonies to give thanks, ceremonies to prepare for something, really fit the definition of what we would call hypnotic transformation, where you are believing in an image while you're in an alternative brainwave frequency. And so they understood that all creatures, I've learned this from wild horses. People want to go to YouTube and put in wild horse hypnotist, they can see. But we have this capability of going beyond the cognitive, which is good for something, but not good enough to really bring automaticity. This is why all the gold medal athletes in the Olympics of the last 20 years use sports psychology, visualization, hypnosis, right? Hypnosis is one of those words we shy away from, and probably for the educators that are here, they don't need to use that word. They can talk about visualization, like with children, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having them, go into breathing and relaxing and slowing down their brain. But that's ultimately the idea, that ceremony is a very, very serious thing, partly because of the transformational things that it does for us, right?
So can I just ask a question about that? So does that also mean, though, for instance, say one had, I mean, that is very much an indigenous, right? When you did the sun ceremony, it's very much based in that. But for someone like myself, a ceremony could be, and correct me if I'm wrong, in my household, cooking and making some type of specific soup or dessert was a way that we showed love. And so
I would not really say that, making a special soup for a special meal, I wouldn't really go deep enough to call that ceremony, right? Mm-hmm. You can say, if there was a ceremonial event where we're going to make this particular dessert and we're going to sit around the table and have it, and there was a lot of meaning to it, right? Then maybe it would rise to the level of ceremony. Okay. So ceremony, but it's not just everybody does ceremonies.
Yeah.
And yet most people doing ceremonies, when they go for Sunday church, for example, they don't know it's trans-based, but
Right.
it is. When
Right.
you go in and you believe that God is there, and you have you've sinned, and you want to pray for somebody who just died, and there's the music and there's the gatherings. No, all those are also trans-based. The problem is it's like not really knowing what it is that is happening. And so ceremonies are very intentional. That's why there's so many of them. It's just not, it's not just
Right.
on, yeah. So
Okay,
I
great.
hope that helps a little bit.
Super. So I wanted to, let's start into the book. So I wanted to first acknowledge that one of the most knowledgeable people, she is Indigenous, Dr. Debbie Reese, and she, there is a link to her blog and also her Twitter handle there. She talks about, and I want to distinguish this. She talks about how to choose excellent children's books by and about Native Americans. So I'm quickly going to walk us through this and give one example, but it's not necessarily what we're talking about here. What we're going to talk about is looking at children's books and understanding how they connect to the Indigenous worldview precepts. So let's first, she says, you need to choose written or illustrated books written or illustrated by Native people. You need to choose books that include information about the nationhood status of Native peoples. You need to choose books that are set in present day. And you need to choose books that are tribally specific. So I have chosen one book to quickly go through to show you how some of those come through. It's a phenomenal book called Fry Bread, written by Kevin Noble Maillard, and illustrated by one of my favorite illustrators, Juana Martinez Neal. He actually wrote this book because when he had a son, he went to look for books by Indigenous people and hardly found any. He is a writer for the New York Times. He's a journalist, and he decided to write this book, and it's very well received, has gotten many prizes. But let's look at some of those things that she was talking about. So on the inside cover and on the back cover of this book are all of the nations in the United States. Now, what he says is one of his favorite parts about this book, and this actually is a page in this book, is that when he sees Indigenous people open up the book and try to find their nation. So that's one of the things that in this book, so I would say that this was, in that perspective, is a great book. Also, this book talks about the creation of fry bread, because he talks about how it is a tradition. That was my question about ceremony. We'll get to it later. But if you look at this book, you see there is a woman who is hugging the little girl with the stripes. She has tattoos on her. It's there is another person who has dreadlocks. It is a current day book, right? So that was another part that she was talking about. So if you are looking for those types of books by and for and about Indigenous people, those are some things you can look at. But what I really want to talk about are a few books, some by Native authors and illustrators, some that are not, but that so vividly show these Indigenous worldview precepts. So these two books, Zonia's Rainforest is perhaps one of my favorite books right now. She is a girl who lives in the Amazon with her mother, and she, throughout the entire book, she is so connected with nature, so goes to earth and all systems as living and loving and animistic and biocentric. And at the end of this book, she comes to the part, she's playing outside, and she comes to a part of the Amazon where all the trees are cut. And the really interesting piece for Arrows about this book is there is a spiritual aspect, because she goes back to her mom and says, "Mom, this is what I found, and it's calling me, and I have to help it." And so you understand this, that the earth is a living being. It's not an it. That is amazing. We Are Water Protectors is a book that is about the pipelines that have been built, and it absolutely embraces these two precepts of Indigenous worldview. So this is a book, You Hold Me Up, that there's an emphasis on community welfare, because it's not about this one person who is rising, right? It's continually throughout the entire book how one student helps another student, how one elder helps another person, and to build a library in your classroom that has these types of books, right? Because we look at books for how we can behave and for the characters that are in them. So this is a book that I absolutely love. Now, many people probably know this book. It's called The Other Side. It makes me just kind of teary looking at it. It's about two girls who actually want to play with each other, but there is this divide, which is the fence. And by the end, what do they decide to do? They decide, because both of their parents have said, you absolutely cannot go over that fence. That is like, so there are these social norms, and we could also talk about hierarchy here, right? But there are social norms that not allowing that. So what do? Which kids always do, they find these solutions that are incredible. They decide to sit on the fence. So neither one of them has gone over the fence, but at the end of the book, they sit on the fence. This is another one, the respect for various gender roles and fluidity. And in Annie's plaid shirt, it's really interesting, because she's going to a very formal event, and her mother goes and tries to get her these, fancy girl clothes, and she keeps saying she doesn't want to wear them. And anyway, by the end, she comes out in her plaid shirt and some really cool pants, and it's absolutely okay. This one is near and dear to my heart, because my oldest daughter, when we were getting ready to go to a wedding, and she was one of the flower girls, or she actually was walking her brother down the aisle, and nothing would have it, she would not wear a dress. And so she wore really cool tux and looked amazing. So this is, I know I always say this a lot, one of my favorite books. I Walk with Vanessa it's by Carrasco, and they are a couple who write and illustrate books. They're from France. It is a wordless picture book, and it is about this new girl, Vanessa, and she goes to school and she gets bullied. And this other little girl in the yellow dress here she walks home with her. She sees how sad she is. And through all of the pictures through the books, all of a sudden she has this idea, and she decides, I'm going to go and I'm going to walk with Vanessa. And she gets all of the other kids to walk with Vanessa to school. So the last picture in the book is they're all walking into school. Vanessa is smiling, and I will say that the bully is a little sad, but it's this empathetic. She shows such empathy and responsibility for helping resolve this situation. So lastly, I want to come back to that first book that we looked at for having a wonderful book by a Native American person in for Native American kids. But I want to look at it through the lens of Indigenous worldview now. So this is why I asked you this. And I would like to say that I would love to talk to some people who really make fry bread, and I think it might be on the ceremony type, but I'm not sure now. But it's definitely in this book. Learning is experiential and collaborative all throughout the book. It shows the kids, and they have flour on them, and the parents are helping them. And there is high interpersonal engagement and touching in this book. I think, you know, that perspective is something that COVID has been really hard with, but hopefully what we've done for you today is kind of opened up your world to think about the possibility of understanding that worldview is really important. And then if indeed you think that an Indigenous worldview is a way to go, there are tangible things, hopefully, that we have shown you in how to, for instance, build a library that is full of books that reflect the Indigenous worldview precepts.
Let me just jump in real quickly, just so that it's not a misunderstanding.
Yes.
The book on fry bread and the emphasis on fry bread, it is a bit different than the other ones that you showed, in that what it is showing isn't about world view per se. The use of fry bread is a brutal consequence of racism. Fry bread was all they had to eat, essentially, and it has become a traditional food on reservations where we have life expectancies of 49 and horrible statistics on just about everything that you can imagine. So fry bread would not be something that would be in our list of 40 things, except that it would represent the dominant worldview's oppression of Indigenous peoples.
So that's really interesting for Arrows, because I need to do more research on that, because I wonder if there has been pushback about that book, because when the author actually spoke about it, and you know, maybe this is because he is far away from the native traditions at this point in his life, but he always talked about it as it's
a gathering. It has become, I mean, because that history is there,
right?
Doesn't mean that's who we are. Fry bread is at every powwow. It has become associated with the modern. Remember, one of those 4 requirements is you got to talk about contemporary Indigenous people, right?
Right.
We're not talking about dances with wolves,
right?
And so, but the knowledge has to be complete. So
yeah, no, you're right.
It is traditional, and it almost rises to, you know, ceremony levels, and it's in our humor, it's in our understandings, but we know that history. But but just because we live on reservations doesn't mean that we don't continue to do our best to thrive. So we are, you know, fry bread is what we eat and on the reservations, and this is who we are. But knowing that whole story,
right,
is very important.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think we're almost out of time for Arrows. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we leave our audience here?
Well, just that I believe that if you could do a list of those kinds of books and have a little statement about them, I think that would be one of the best ways to indigenize and decolonize the education system that is imaginable. I think if people could read those and look at those, for example, the little girl that was looking out at spirit, Darcia Narvaez and I have a book coming out called Recovering Our Kinship-Based Worldview. And one of the opening, we have quotes from Indigenous people. The opening one is from a woman who talks about her culture. The little children would go out into the forest at night, very scary forest, to find their spirit, to find the one that was their particular spirit, right? And I saw that in that little book. So thank you for that. I'm going to start trying to pick your brain and start collecting all of those books that I can.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And we hope that we have dipped your toe in this idea and hopefully spurred some curiosity in you about really doing some more thinking and work in terms of where do we go after decolonization, and how are we actually making it true and effective in our classrooms. So thank you.
Remember, we're all indigenous to this planet.
Great. Thank you.